En það bara opið það bara fyrir spurningar og Erling hérna, hann ætlar að fá að stjórna því.
Já.
Lagt. Getur svo vel.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
I will direct questions to you. I will ask people just to raise their hand and speak. Try to keep your questions short, less than a minute. And if you can speak English and direct them directly to Mr. Miller, that would be good. But if you are not comfortable with that, speak Icelandic, and I'll do my best to translate. Start over here.
Yes, I just wanted to repeat your definition of propaganda that you did earlier on. I missed it. If you could just repeat.
Sure. Any organized attempt to move large numbers of people to some thought or action, or away from some thought or action. That's it.
Yes?
How does one do research on it if all of the search engines are usually owned and have interests in these kind of globalist companies?
Did you all hear the question?
Yes.
That's an excellent question. As the internet has made it easier for us to find the other side of the story, right? Key players in that world, in league with governments, have worked ever harder to make it more difficult to find the other side of the story online. So if you do a Google search on pretty much anything, you're going to get results that suit Google's interests. And of course, Google owns 2 pharmaceutical companies, among other things, and also has a very close relationship with the state. So for a while, we were using DuckDuckGo to get the other side of the story, but now DuckDuckGo has become like Google. So now I'm using Brave, which has a pre-search feature that seems very good, and until that one collapses, I'll continue to use Brave. So it's a great question. It's an important question because you know, in the digital world, it becomes ever more of a challenge to find out what's really going on. It can be done, but it becomes ever more difficult. And the necessary first step for anyone trying to determine the truth is to know that that's a problem. See? Did I answer you?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you think all governments are now connected about this one goal?
How did that happen?
How did it happen?
Well, that's
that was my biggest surprise, you know. How did they get all the governments?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I can't pretend to be privy to the answer to that question because they haven't invited me over. But we can, okay, at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, I will note that governments that did not play ball paid a steep price for it. There's Dr. John Magufuli, the president of Tanzania, who was a trained chemist and a very eminent chemist, and who had the government of Tanzania conduct tests of the test, the PCR test. Have you heard this?
Yes.
Right, okay. Well, maybe not everybody. So he found out that like a pawpaw, the fruit, had tested positive for COVID, right? And a goat had tested. So he realized that the test was ridiculous and he didn't want to use it. And he was also speaking out against the vaccines. So then he disappeared. And he was missing for 2 weeks. And then the Western press reported gleefully that he had died of COVID. Okay. So millions of people read this and felt a surge of malicious satisfaction that this autocratic virus denier, good on him, he died of COVID. Well, he didn't die of COVID, he died of a heart attack, as his vice president told Tanzania. So any journalists lying about his death could have just referred to her. She said he died of a heart attack. He may have been heart attacked, if you know what I'm saying. The same was the case with President of Haiti and was it Rwanda? There were 4 African heads of state who died, but there's evidence that only 2 of them were actually opposing the agenda. I forget what the second one was, but Magufuli certainly, the head of this other African country, and the government of Haiti, and the president of Belarus was also skeptical and thought the society should stay open. And then he was subjected to, all kinds of defamatory propaganda. And then what looked like the beginnings of a kind of color revolution in Belarus. See? So what I'm suggesting to you is that there are grounds for thinking that they managed to get all the governments on board through a combination of infiltration of governments with young global leaders, the World Economic Forum, and payoffs and bribery, positive inducements, but also, threats and violence, because this is a global agenda that they're pushing ruthlessly, so that any politician who has opposed it becomes targeted in the way that any dissident gets targeted by the media, you see. And I can't stress this strongly enough, that it is now significant, it's significantly dangerous now to contradict the narrative. See, when the CIA did its memo in '67, the premise of the propaganda they were urging was that conspiracy theory is ridiculous. Tinfoil hats. It's like funny. These people are cracked. Ha ha. Over the decades, and especially starting around 2010, conspiracy theory came to seem less and less like a laughing matter and more like a national security threat. So you're a domestic terrorist if you're a conspiracy theorist now. And now the US has been joined by the EU and the UK, I don't know if any of you knows this, in creating a disinformation governance board. You heard this?
Yes.
A disinformation governance board. They're going to tell us what's true. What could go wrong? There's another phrase for that. That's Ministry of Truth, right? So it's a matter of some urgency that we argue with the narrative. But looking at the plight of Julian Assange, we can see what happens to you when you do contradict that story. When you cast a shadow on that story, you are asking for trouble. And the only way to make sure that does not happen is to continue to speak out against the narrative. Can't arrest everybody.
Over here.
Can you tell me who are they and what do you know about the Sandy Hook shooting?
What made you bring that up? The Sandy Hook shooting. That often comes up because thank you for that question. The Sandy Hook shooting.
That was in an Icelandic newspaper about you.
I know. I was kept very well acquainted with that whole thing. The reporter who wrote that story had done a Google search on me, I assume, and discovered a piece attacking me that came out a year ago in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is kind of like the New York Times for academics. It was a piece called The Professor of Paranoia. And I urge you to read it. Okay? I urge you to read the piece. This guy, whom I knew at NYU when he was on the faculty, popped up. He did not get tenure, unfortunately for him. And he popped up and he asked if he could do this piece about me. And I was a little suspicious. He said, yes, you can, but I want our Zoom conversations to be mine. I want to put them up on my website. And I'm also going to post our entire email correspondence. Okay? So if anyone wants to understand how a hit piece is crafted, you can read that article and then go to my website to read the raw materials that he used to write this piece. And one of the things he mentions in his piece is my alleged belief that Sandy Hook did not happen. There was no shooting there. All right, this is what that comes from. I have a listserv that all of you are welcome to join if you're interested. It costs nothing. You can go to my website and sign up. It's thousands of people, and I just send everybody emails every day, usually of stories that most people haven't heard or that have been misreported by the media. So it's a kind of a news service. I once shared an article. Okay, you opened a can of worms, and I'm going to have to take a moment to explain. You all know what Sandy Hook is, right? There's this big shooting, all these little kids got killed, etc. 2012, right? So there is a book of essays with a provocative title, No One Died at Sandy Hook. And it's a collection of essays by different people, maybe a dozen, essays that raise a number of really startling truths about that narrative. It is a very compelling book, and I think people should read that book. I read the book, and I found myself doubting whether Sandy Hook happened as advertised. Okay? Now, the editor of the book, a guy named James Fetzer, was sued for defamation by one of the Sandy Hook parents, or Sandy Hook alleged parents. And the parent came up with a birth certificate for his child, or his alleged child. Fetzer hired 2 handwriting experts with FBI experience and asked them to testify on his behalf because they both found that the birth certificate was a forgery. In the trial, however, the judge refused to let the jury hear from those witnesses and gave no reason. I think that's notable. I think people should know that. I think, first of all, I hope it didn't happen. I hope Sandy Hook didn't happen because I hope those children weren't killed. Does that make me a monster? Okay? The fact is, I don't know whether it happened or not. I do know that there's compelling material suggesting that it didn't. But what I do believe is, this is the answer to your question, at long last, the matter should be properly adjudicated by a court. That's what I think. I think a court should look into this and make a determination. Okay? Now, what was your first question? It was a 2-part question.
Who are they?
Who are they?
Talking about they?
Well, when did I say they?
The people who control the world or are doing all this work.
Yeah, again, they've never invited me over. So I don't know who they are exactly, but I believe that they would probably include the wealthiest dynasties out there. I would believe they would include the Rockefellers, the Windsors, the Rothschilds, etc., because they have an inordinate amount of power. And it takes tremendous power to organize a global operation like this. To get the world media saying the same things for 2 years, to get health authorities compromised for all that time, takes a tremendous amount of power. And so I'm guessing that those are the entities that have that kind of power. It's the best I can do.
We have a question in the middle of the back.
What is your take on moving Julian Assange to the US and also the increase of controlled opposition?
Julian Assange and controlled opposition. Extraditing Julian Assange to the United States is horrendous. I mean, it would be a death sentence for him. And the whole thing is straight out of 1984. In 1984, there are no laws. There's a passage in the novel, Winston Smith is thinking about the fact there are no laws. You can't break the law because there are no laws. You just get arrested and tortured and killed, right? So what law did Julian Assange break? Nobody can answer that question. I mean, some people who are not well informed will say, oh, he raped somebody in Sweden. But that whole case fell apart and the Swedish government dropped it. So why is he in this predicament? I'll tell you why he's in this predicament, because he cast a shadow on the propaganda for the war on terror. And that's what you don't do, right? You don't cast shadows on the propaganda narrative. So I think he should be let loose, he should be freed as soon as possible, and he should sue the British and American governments. I mean, that's what I think should happen, it won't. it's an abomination. What's happened to him is a crime against, well, humanity, really, not just him. And indeed, I've thought of him over the last couple of years as the canary in the coal mine, if you know that expression. That what happened to him anticipated what's happened to countless other truth tellers. So, that, that's my feeling there. Now, controlled opposition. I think there is controlled opposition. I am, however, reluctant to jump on board campaigns to accuse somebody or other of being controlled opposition, because if you are controlled opposition, you are likeliest to accuse others of being controlled opposition. You follow me? So my friend Bobby Kennedy, and I'm proud to call him my friend, there are people calling him controlled opposition. And the people calling him controlled opposition, as far as I'm concerned, are controlled opposition. See? Robert Malone. I had my doubts about him because he does have deep state connections, as he himself reveals. But I stuck with it and looked into it sufficiently to be satisfied that he is not controlled opposition, that he didn't really realize how heinous this whole thing is. And once he did, he was very outspoken about it, So I can think of a few people who I believe to be controlled opposition. I'm not going to name them here. But I think that we have to be very cautious about that accusation.
Another gentleman at the counter.
Yes, Mr. Miller, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, do you know of any examples where an ambitious propaganda push has failed? Obviously, Syria survived, but I believe that's because of the third-party intervention, of the Russian intervention. But how do you fight this from within the group of victims of the propaganda? Is it a fight, a winnable fight?
Well, I have to think it is winnable. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, and I'd be very depressed.
Any examples you remember where
It didn't
people
work?
themselves have woken up to the truth and stopped the...
Well, that's a really good question. That is a really good question, which I may have to take some time to answer. And I won't know where you are to tell you what I think.
I follow you on Substack and everywhere.
Oh, okay. Well, there have been propaganda drives that have not taken, that have not really worked. For example, it was a little late when it finally fell apart, but the claim that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and was behind 9/11, that served the purpose of enabling the invasion of Iraq, which was atrocious. But then it kind of fell apart, and the media now readily acknowledges that it was false, which they don't usually do. The New York Times continues to pretend that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy, So, you're married to these narratives. Usually it's like a permanent union, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes they fail, but the thing to understand is that if people who really know what they're doing as propaganda masters, if they really know what they're doing, then they will know enough to tell people what they want to hear. This is crucial. Propaganda has to tell you what you want to hear. It cannot go against your desires and your preconceptions. So when they craft a propaganda drive, they have to find language that will resonate with you. See, we're not innocent, right? We can't claim to be purely victimized by the propaganda makers because it takes two to tango. We have to basically agree. And if they tell us things that we want to hear, we will agree, right? Why did the conspiracy theory propaganda, one of the most successful propaganda drives in history, it really, really succeeded. Why did it succeed? Why does it work? Because people naturally don't want to think that their government killed the president in broad daylight. They don't want to think that the government flew planes into the Twin Towers. Who wants to think that? Who wants to think that their own government would engage in false flag operations? Nobody wants to. Who wants to think that their top health authorities are completely compromised by Big Pharma and don't care how many people die as a result of this or that treatment or lack of treatment? Nobody wants to think that. And I get that. I understand that, right? So all we can really do to answer your question, and this is kind of a feeble answer, is just keep telling the truth, you know, unafraid and, you know, without aggression, and as rationally as possible, and adducing as much evidence as possible in full awareness of the fact the evidence itself and logic itself will not change people's minds very often. If people are terrorized enough, if they're really, really frightened and angry, then they'll just get mad if you argue with that, you know, and you determine whether or not it's worth trying to tell them. Is that an answer, adequate?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have a lady in the back corner here, first.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. It's great. I have a question concerning, like, yes, us, the people. You know, it's been astounding for me, for example, that people that are well-educated and smart people, you know, they don't seem to realize or distinguish or want to ask a question. So I was thinking about the psychological part that you mentioned in the beginning, the Freud thing. How can people prepare themselves mentally and spiritually to be able to see this? I mean, for me, I just see it. I post to the global warming scam, also COVID, the vaccines, and now this Ukraine, Russia thing. I see it, and other people don't see it. And like I realized, like people that have a good education and are in good position, smart people, they don't seem to see it. And then we meet some regular people who maybe never went to school, and they see it. Like what is it?
That's a really,
why are people so different?
no, that's a really good question. And
Why is it like? Is there any psychology study on this, or is it
well,
spiritual thing, or like for me, I just have to get my head around this. What is really happening? Some people see this clear as day, and others they do not only not see it, they somehow, yeah, like we said, they get angry and scared. And these are smart people who are usually like very smart and have done a lot of studies and but they refuse to put on propaganda. They're just like, what is it? Is there any explanation?
Well, I think there is. I'll hazard one, right? As for the question of mass psychology, I'm sure you've all, or many of you, have listened to Matthias Desmet, you know, the clinical psychologist, who has a new book out called The Psychology of Totalitarianism, which I'm reading now and I recommend strongly. The book is not so much about what he calls mass formation, but he's given many interviews on that process, mass formation, which is a kind of mass hypnosis. And so if one wants to understand the psychology of this, I think one would begin with him. However, he doesn't really address the question that you're raising, which is, why is it that the educated seem to be the most credulous and the least critical? I think, first of all, I think that's definitely true. We are continually struck by the difference between professionals with advanced degrees and working people. Because working people have tended to be more skeptical. I mean, they'll go along with the COVID measures, but they're not happy about it. They're not militant in defense of them the way that my colleagues are at NYU, the way academics are, the way doctors are, right? The way journalists are. The fact is that this catastrophe is the result of an inexcusable moral failure on the part of the professional classes. Okay, that's what's happened. And why is this? You know, back when he was still lucid, Noam Chomsky made the observation that that it is educated people who fall hardest for propaganda because they are the more invested in the official narrative, and he was right about that. I mean, now he thinks that unvaccinated people should be put in camps. And what about their food? Well, that's their problem. That's Chomsky, okay? So he's dead to me, right? But when he wrote that back in the 60s and 70s and so on, he was absolutely right. And my own study of the Third Reich bears it out. I don't know if any of you has read Victor Klemperer's diary, this wonderful diary he kept through the whole 12-year Reich. He was born Jewish. He had converted to, I think, Lutheranism, and he had an Aryan wife. So he managed to survive the whole thing. They lived in Dresden, and he wrote this marvelous diary. It's easily the best diary from that period. And repeatedly in the diary, he recounts, running into educated people who had soaked up all the anti-Semitic propaganda and were pretty rabid. Whereas a lot of the working people he met left him alone. So he seemed to observe something very similar to what we're seeing now, right? Somehow, there's a book, let me recommend another book, it's called Disciplined Minds, by a man named Jeffrey Schmidt, S-C-H-M-I-D-T. It's a study of professional training, whether it's journalism school or medical school or law school or graduate school. He demonstrates how professional training functions to squeeze all the idealism out of the young people who go into those programs, and basically ensures that they will follow orders and serve agendas that they don't really like. So young people will go into physics, for example, because they want to do pure science. They have to be prepared to do their physics on behalf of the military-industrial complex. So he explains, in a very, intelligent way, how at every step professional training gets you ready to play that role. From the time you apply to the school, to the time you get out, to the time you apply for jobs, to the time you try to get promoted, that it works that way. See? And I think that helps explain why the professionals have fallen for this, added to which is the fact that professional types, especially academics, and I know them all too well, right? I've been teaching since the 70s. They're so arrogant that they think they can't be fooled. So if they read the New York Times, and they watch CNN, everything they read and watch has to be true, because they believe it. And they're really smart. So it's just the kind of arrogance. That's the best I can do to answer you.
Could you briefly touch on if someone wanted to, dive into this, just hearing it about, like, let's say someone just heard about it for the first time, right? And they are trying to figure out who is this they, like someone else asked, and they're skeptical of it because it's such a big idea. What are some issues that they could look into in terms of how elitists have done this in the past, like the Population Council or like the founder of PAN, things like that.
That's a really good question. Well, okay, speaking specifically of the current moment and this agenda, I personally would recommend that people study the history of eugenics.
Oh, eugenics, yeah.
Eugenics, right, which was the pseudoscience based on the idea that the fit should reproduce like rabbits, while the unfit should not reproduce at all, right? Eugenics, like Greek for good genes kind of thing, right? What's happening now, I believe, is an offshoot of the eugenics movement. To make a good start on studying that history, which is not taught in schools, although it led directly to the Holocaust. There's a book called War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. That's the best general history of eugenics. Because they were perfectly willing to kill off the unfit, right? And they understood that in ethnic terms. For them, eugenics was a matter of getting rid of faulty races. Jews, Gypsies, Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, black people certainly, right? Now the project is a bit different. Now it's a matter of, Bill Gates talking about the necessity of cutting down the global population to save the planet. So it's not like you want to produce a master race, which was the way they were thinking 100 years ago. And Hitler was heavily influenced by the eugenics movement in the United States, heavily influenced. And the eugenics movement in the United States was overjoyed when Hitler became chancellor. Because they said, finally, a head of state who understands our science. They were flattering themselves, they called it a science. Then the Holocaust happened, and the footage of the death camps, people saw that, and whoops, wait a minute, hold the phone. We didn't mean it. Eugenics went underground, and they didn't call it eugenics anymore. Now they call it population control. And this started in 1952, 7 years after the war, with the rollout of the Population Council in the United States, and that was backed by the Rockefellers. And the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and the Harrimans, these wealthy families were the most lavish funders of eugenics. See? So when I talk about the Rockefellers now, I'm not just talking through my hat, there is a precedent, and that's what your question meant. Right. There's a precedent. So people need to understand that precedent, and so I would study that. I would also study the Great Reset, which is, the avowed purpose of the whole COVID crisis. If you look at the book itself by Klaus Schwab, he, makes it pretty clear that this is an opportunity to change humankind and the planet and human society in fundamental ways. They're perfectly clear about this, You would want to read that too and see what they're talking about. And you mentioned climate change. We're now hearing people suggest, like Klaus Schwab's daughter the other day said, we need to pivot from COVID to climate change, which basically means we need climate lockdowns now to save the planet. And that's an idea with a lot of appeal. A lot of appeal. Is that adequate? Okay.
Couple more questions, perhaps?
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you. My question is about the importance of people knowing about how propaganda is made. And luckily you have been answering the question here very great about the school system. But my question is, do you know about any school in the world or in the school system at any age that are already or have any, maybe have to teach about how propaganda is made?
I can only say that I know other professors who teach courses on that. There's a bunch of us started something called the Organization for Propaganda Study, OPS. Piers Robinson is a friend of mine, teaches in Germany, and has been very active digging into the Syria propaganda, and has been much attacked by the media for doing so. And others who've taken their lumps, who study propaganda. We started this association so that we could help to promote the more impartial and critical teaching of propaganda study, everywhere we can make that happen. As I said before, I think it should be taught in every school, right? So I can only say, I don't know of any schools that have formal programs in this kind of thing, but I do know individual professors who are inclined to make that work.
Thank you. Excuse me, sorry. One gentleman in the back.
So thank you very much for giving us this excellent lecture. I can 100% agree with it, and I think the most important final question is, what gave you the strength to be so strong, to be here today, to fight all those years, despite all the opposition? Because everybody go home now, and we are faced with the same situation, as we have been already, being attacked from all around. What gives you the strength to move forward unwaveringly And what do you suggest to us? What could help us to be ourselves like you? Thank you.
Jeez. What gives me the strength? I'm a little crazy, I think. I mean, I don't feel that I have any choice. And to be perfectly honest, you don't either. I mean, this is not, a few decades ago, or let's just say before COVID, people tended to think that they had a choice whether they could be political or not. You know? Well, I'd like to be political, or I don't have time for that, I'd rather tend my garden. And I get that, I'd like to tend mine, you know? But the fact is, once you recognize how dire the situation is, you can't say that to yourself anymore. You don't have that option. If you do nothing, if you say nothing, if you just let it roll over you, it will crush you eventually. You know, we're talking about an agenda that they will push through if people don't resist it. They will push it through, and if they push it through, they will come for you, even if you're fully vaccinated, even if you're fully boosted. You know, they'll just keep moving the goalposts and say, now you have to have a shot every 10 minutes. You know, you have to be tested every morning, first thing, you know, bright and early. You know, I mean, and if you look at the Great Reset, they actually say with a straight face, I assume they're not laughing behind their hands, you know, under the Great Reset, you will have no privacy, you will own nothing, and you'll never be happier. Well, if you want to live that way, then don't speak up, you know. Everything's going to be peachy for you, right? But if you don't like that idea, if you don't want them vaccinating your kids, for example, right, you have to speak up. So what gives one the strength? I mean, one feels that one's doing the right thing, that one can look oneself in the eye, you know? I mean, I can speak more personally about it. I have had kind of a spiritual awakening myself since this thing started, because I actually believe this is pure evil. This is not just greed. This is not just incompetence. This is a crisis throughout which, from the beginning, they have systematically promoted measures that are destructive and systematically suppressed treatments that work. That's an accident? No. That's incompetence? Well, if it's incompetence, it's a kind of criminal incompetence. The fact is, it's deliberate, and it is all tied up with the desire to cull the numbers of the global population, and that is evil. I'll just say one thing about something I'm doing every week on my Substack.
Can you say the name of it? How to join?
Well, okay, right. If you want to join my listserv, you go to markcrispinmiller.com, and you can just sign up.
Free.
And if you don't want to be overwhelmed with emails, you know, have your inbox fill up with them, you can pick the daily digest option, and then you just get one email a day with all that day's emails in them, okay? Then, if you go to Substack, if you do a search on my name in Substack, you'll come to my Substack. Substack is a platform for writers who won't get published anywhere else, as I won't. It's been a long time since I was invited to publish anywhere. My own writings I post there, okay? And one of the things I'm doing every week, every Wednesday, I post a compilation of reports of people who have died suddenly worldwide. Okay, let me explain. Died suddenly or died unexpectedly. Those phrases formerly were obituary code for suicide or drug overdose. So in 2015, if you read an obituary that says so-and-so died suddenly, you know a person killed himself or OD'd. It's not the same now. First of all, the number of reports of people who died suddenly, that number has increased fourfold since 2 years ago. And as you read the articles, and it's beyond heartbreaking to read them, you realize that is literally what happened, is people just dropped dead. You know, like sometimes biking, walking, in church, getting a COVID test, you just drop dead, right? So it's valuable to compile them for several reasons. First of all, there's no end of scientific studies now demonstrating, and statistical studies, that there's been an enormous increase in all-cause mortality. 40% increase, country after country, since the rollout of the vaccination drive. But that doesn't move people. Now I'm speaking as a propaganda practitioner. That's statistics, right? That's a statistic, 40% increase in all-cause mortality. It doesn't hit you here. Remember what Stalin said, you know, one man dies, it's a tragedy, 1 million are killed, it's a statistic, right? That Stalin was a pistol, wasn't it? So that's a statistic. It doesn't, you know, all right, that's terrible. But to compile all the reports so that there are names and faces, that's different. That's stronger. And when you read the articles, you can see how the media continues to try to normalize this. See, one of the things I discovered is that there are all these different things that the media has headlined to tell us that it is not the injections that are doing this. And the things they've come up with are beyond laughable, okay? Hot weather, cold weather, environmental noise, referees' whistles. I'm not making that up. All these athletes dropping dead mid-game, it's the referees' whistles they induce. I'm not kidding. The most mind-boggling toll is in Italy. Okay, Italy it's staggering. Well, an Italian magazine came out with a cover story that pizza margaritas were killing all these Italians. Okay, now, here's the thing. We're talking about propaganda. All of these articles in the media, these ridiculous headlines, and I've only scratched the surface. I think there's 30 or 40 of these ridiculous explanations of why children are dying of massive heart attacks, right? I just lost the thread of what I was saying.
Do that every Wednesday on Substack.
Well, no, that's going back further than necessary. Right.
Margaritas in Italy?
Margaritas in Italy.
There's 30 or 40 exposés.
Oh, yes, thank you. All these articles were prompted by scientific studies. See? So, scientific study found that pizza margarita will kill you, or a scientific study found that a referee's whistle will kill you, or hot weather will kill you, or heartbreak, sadness, kills women especially. So, in order for these studies to be produced in time for the media to headline their findings, they had to have been funded some time ago. You see? You see? So this didn't just sort of happen. You know, scientists didn't just write a study and send it out. They had to have funding for it, so they had to apply for funding for it. This means this whole thing has been in the works for some time. See? You learn a lot from studying propaganda systematically. If you study issues through the lens of propaganda study, you learn things you wouldn't learn ordinarily, you know? Okay.
May I ask
Sure.
a few questions? I like it how to remember them. It's about Russia, Putin. People say he's going to take over everything. He's dangerous. And this question. I also have another question. Why is China locking up people? What message are they sending to us? And another question.
Maybe try to stick it with two or...
And one more.
Okay.
World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, and EU, and China and Putin. Are they all working together to what are they? What is the goal?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's a question that has been much discussed, you know. And again, Putin has yet to invite me over so he can tell me, what he's doing. I don't know. Xi Jinping's never called me, I'm a little bit offended. The thing is that there are extremely convincing arguments on both sides concerning, for example, Russia, okay? There are people who think that Putin demolished the whole COVID thing and derailed it and destroyed it and is working at direct cross purposes with the globalists. They say that. Then there are people who say he's in on it. He was a young global leader, etc. I think the situation is too nuanced to be explained through either simple narrative. I think that it is ridiculous to claim that the COVID narrative has been dismantled in Russia. It has not been. I mean, I have a number of Russian friends, and they have made it very clear to me that Russia is in the tight grip of the COVID narrative, and they're giving millions of injections, and I'm finding people dropping dead all over Russia too, and China, okay? So I would not credit Putin with, destroying that whole thing, and I don't even know if he's in charge vis-a-vis that narrative. Who knows? I have no idea, right? I don't know. I do know from what I've read and studied. Let's back up. Something I say to my propaganda class, or did say when they let me teach propaganda, and I would always say, like at least once a week, don't believe a single word I say. Okay? You, don't believe a single word I say about Sandy Hook. Don't ask me. Go read it. Go research it. You decide. Same here. Okay? So if I say something about what I think is going on with Russia or China, it's just what I think based on what I've studied, but I'm not an oracle. I'm not an oracle here, right? But I do think Putin was, I certainly don't think he invaded Ukraine when he did in furtherance of the globalist agenda. I know people who think that he timed it that way, to take our minds off the vaccination. I think he was provoked to invade when he was provoked to invade for that purpose. Because all of a sudden, in the twinkling of an eye, we went from vaccines to Ukraine. I mean, it was mind-boggling. All of a sudden, the same people who were, wanted you to be locked up for not getting a shot were dyeing their hair blue and yellow. Crazy. So I think that, Russia is a mixed bag. As far as COVID is concerned, Russia's part of it. As far as COVID is concerned, China is at least part of it, if not in some ways driving it. I tend to be suspicious of people who say that China's driving it. I think it's more accurate to say that China is the ideal society as far as the globalists are concerned. They want the whole world to be China. They want AI in charge. They want whimsical lockdowns that will go on forever. What's happening in Shanghai is beyond atrocious. It's horrendous, and I am disgusted, although not shocked, that a lot of people I know will spring to the defense of China because it's China. And if you criticize China, what am I trying to say? If you are critical of China, you're working for the CIA. That's what they think. Because look, propaganda. There's two things about propaganda that are worth noting. One is propaganda always reduces all reality to one single thing. Right? So when they were, demonizing Trump, but Trump was the only thing wrong with American politics since the American Revolution. Trump. It's just Trump. Right? Trump. Trump, Putin, Trump, Putin, Putin, Trump, Trump, Putin. You know what I'm saying? Climate change. Nothing else is wrong with the environment. Not air pollution, not water pollution, not microplastics, not chemical fertilizers, not radiation, not glyphosate. No problem. CO2. Global warming. Global warming. Global warming. You understand? COVID. Ukraine. See, nothing's happening in Yemen. Nobody's dying in Yemen. Nobody's dying in Syria. Nobody's dying in Ethiopia. Ukraine. So that's what, propaganda does that. It reduces the whole field of reality to one thing. You become a monomaniac, The other thing about propaganda is it is always melodramatic. Okay? What's melodrama? Melodrama is different from tragedy, right? Tragedy concerns a tragic hero who's divided within, right? Flawed. Melodrama is about the good versus the bad, the black versus the white. I don't mean that in racial terms, I mean in moral terms. Propaganda is always melodramatic. So there are good forces and bad forces. So Ukraine is good. Even though their insignia all have modified swastika designs on them, and they're actually speaking out loud about annihilating the Russian people and incinerating Moscow. They're saying these things. They're teaching their little kids to talk about killing Russian people. No, Ukraine's good. And Putin's bad because Putin, Hitler. Putin, Hitler, Trump. Hitler, Putin, Trump.
One more. Can trade, and do they have power to change the weather and make laws and stuff? Can you just please?
You can wrap it up.
All I can say is that the U.S. government, the military, has been working on weather modification since the 1940s. This is, they used to talk about this in the New York Times before it became a conspiracy theory. Yeah, they're working on weather modification. They certainly are, and I personally believe that they have created certain catastrophic, seemingly climate-related events in order to drive that narrative.
In Australia?
Well, I was thinking of California. But, climate change, very interesting. This is one of these subjects on which I had to change my views once I studied the propaganda, because I was really, really concerned about climate change. I was losing sleep over it. And I was thinking, isn't there some way for cars at intersections to shut off so they don't idle? I was actually worried about that, and I'm the last person in the world you turn to for anything like that. But I was thinking, this is something we can do. So then I, teaching my course on propaganda, and I noticed, first of all, that the hockey stick graph, you guys know that graph? It's this famous graph that this team of scientists put together, which showed that the world's climate was like this for centuries, through the Middle Ages. And then all of a sudden, in the 20th century, it shot up like this, okay? Now, that graph was incorporated into the climate regulations by the UN. So this had a real impact on policy. So I'm looking into this, and not only do I find that 3 or 4 separate teams of mathematicians have debunked the graph on mathematical grounds, but there was a lawsuit in Canada, I believe, in which the lead scientist who developed the graph, Michael Mann is his name, was asked by the court to give them all his raw data. And he wouldn't. But what that tells me is he either didn't have any raw data or he misrepresented it. Okay, that's one. 2, there's a woman named Susan Crockford who is the world's leading authority on polar bears. She wrote a book, short book, which gives us the good news that the polar bears are flourishing. And she believes in global warming. She doesn't argue with that. She thinks the planet's getting warmer, and she thinks it's because of anthropogenic, influences. But she says, look, the polar bears, alive and well. She lost her teaching job. They fired her. All right, that tells me there's something really wrong there. And then third, there's a scientist named Paul Ridd, R-I-D-D, this is Australia, who criticized a colleague at the school where he taught because the colleague had claimed that coral reefs were dying because of climate change. And this guy, I think rather intemperately, he was pissed, he didn't like this, he criticized his colleague and said, this is absurd. You know, these coral reefs are bleaching, but they're thriving, right? So then he was fired from his job. And then he sued. And he was awarded a big amount of money. And then the university appealed. And they rescinded his award. And he took it to the highest court in Australia, and they found against him. Okay, now, so now I really strongly doubt the whole thing. And I especially if you read The Great Reset, you see how crucial a role climate change plays in the whole narrative. And now
The glaciers are getting smaller here.
What?
The glaciers are getting smaller, aren't they?
I don't know.
No?
Don't ask me.
Maybe that's what.
Ég ætla bara, ég held að það sé komið tíma að við bara slöfum þessu og hérna, any final words you wanna say, Mr. Miller?
Solutions?
What?
Solutions, please.
Solution. Well, solutions. I mean, I think we have to keep telling the truth. And we have to keep resisting, you know? And we have to forge alliances. That's crucially important. Because something I haven't even brought up today is the crucial sub-theme of division. Division. The propaganda I've been talking about is all divisive. It's been insanely divisive since Trump became president in 2016. And it's just continued to be divisive. And every one of the propaganda chapters I've described in the last 2 years is divisive. It is the oldest trick in the imperial playbook, is to keep people at each other's throats so that people are not at their throats, whoever they are, right? The Babylonians did it, the Romans did it, the British did it, the Americans do it, right? So we have to, I would throw out the left-right schema. It's useless at this point, right? The left is no longer the left, as far as I can see, it's something else. And those whom the left calls far right, like me, are not far right, you know? Neither is Gunnar far right. That's just a way to shut people up. All the more reason why we should absolutely not shut up.
Guðtíða, Ólafur ætla að spyrja.
Ein spurning viðbót og lokasvör. Gjörðu svo það.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I was just wondering how much do the governments in each country know or hold truth about COVID and vaccine? Governments, health authorities, hospital boards?
Well,
and how many know?
That's another, again, they haven't had me over to tell me. But I don't know how many of you has read Bobby Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci. I strongly recommend that book because it does, it says everything we need to know about the COVID crisis and Fauci and Gates' role in it. I think that the top health authorities in many instances are well aware that there's no way they could not be well aware. There is no way Dr. Fauci doesn't know what's actually going on. His demonic role in all this extends back to the HIV/AIDS moment, you know, which in a way was a dress rehearsal for COVID, propaganda-wise, which is a subject of a whole separate talk. I think that there are some who convince themselves that it's true, you know, because that's where their money comes from. You know, people will adapt to what pays them off.
I work at the hospital and no doctor seems to know anything.
They don't seem to know anything.
No, I'm in psychiatric ward.
Yeah, I know a number of doctors who are astonishingly clueless.
Yeah.
You know, and then you look back at their professional training. You know, how much study of vaccinology do they do in medical school? I know in my country it's like half a day, half of one day they study vaccinology. And this whole thing actually predates COVID because of the vaccine regimen pushed by the CDC and the side effects of that. You know, and that's a whole other subject.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, svo ég held við ættum bara að þakka Miller fyrir